It was just another normal day of the courthouse. The sound of people walking through the hallways, voices echoing off the marble floors, and the rustling of papers filled the air. The courthouse was a place of business, full of lawyers, judges, defendants, and plaintiffs, all there to take care of important matters. A big old building with high ceilings and grand wooden doors, it was filled with people moving back and forth, doing their work, and following the usual routine. But among the usual chaos of the courthouse, one person was about to make a huge difference, though nobody knew it yet. The security guard, named Dave, had been working at the courthouse for many years. He was tall, with a broad build, and wore a serious face as he manned the front entrance. His job was simple: check everyone coming in and out of the building. Over the years, he had grown tired of dealing with the same old routine. People would show up, go through security, and go about their business. He had seen it all: judges, lawyers, and everyone in between. He thought he knew exactly what to expect each day, and no one ever surprised him. Dave's job wasn't easy. He had to follow the rules strictly, always making sure there were no exceptions. Anyone who seemed out of place was questioned. He had to keep the courthouse safe, and for him, that meant making sure no one slipped through the cracks. It didn't matter who you were or how important you looked. If you were following the rules, you were fine. If not, well, he was the one who would deal with it. As Dave stood by the doors, checking people one by one, his eyes scanned the crowd, looking for anyone who might stand out. That's when he saw him, a man walking up toward the courthouse entrance. The man was dressed in a nice suit, but there was something about him that seemed different. It wasn't his clothes, but something in the way he carried himself. The man walked with a quiet confidence, but he didn't look like anyone Dave had seen around the courthouse before. The black man didn't look like a lawyer or a judge. He didn't have the formal air that many people in the courthouse did. Instead, he looked like an ordinary person, walking in with a sense of purpose but not drawing attention. His smooth, dark skin and neatly combed hair made him stand out in the crowd, but it wasn't anything too unusual. There was nothing about him that would make anyone think he was someone important. At least, not at first glance. Without thinking much of it, Dave took his usual position, standing at the entrance, ready to check anyone who walked in. As the man approached, Dave's eyes narrowed slightly. His instinct told him something wasn't quite right. Maybe it was the fact that the man didn't look like he belonged. Or maybe it was just that feeling Dave had learned to trust over the years. Either way, he was about to make sure the man wasn't a problem. The black man approached the security checkpoint, expecting to enter the building as everyone else had. But Dave's sharp eyes didn't miss a beat. He looked the man up and down, then waved his hand to stop him before he could take another step. "Hey you," Dave said firmly. "Where do you think you're going?" The man paused, confused for a moment, then looked up at Dave. "I'm here for a meeting," he said calmly. But Dave wasn't convinced. He stepped closer, his eyes scanning the man's suit, looking for any reason to question him. There was something about the man's appearance that didn't sit right with Dave, something he couldn't quite place. Dave was used to seeing all types of people come through the courthouse, but this man didn't fit the usual mold. "Meeting? What kind of meeting?" Dave asked, his voice more demanding now. "We don't just let anyone in here. What's your business?" The man stood still for a moment, unsure of how to respond. He had been through enough in life to know that sometimes people made assumptions about him based on his appearance. But he wasn't someone who would argue or raise his voice. Instead, he tried to keep his calm and answer the security guard's question as clearly as possible. "I'm here for a very important meeting," the man said again, his tone calm but firm. "I have an appointment with the court." Dave didn't seem convinced. He crossed his arms and gave the man a hard look, almost like he was inspecting him, trying to decide if the man was lying. There was something in the way the man spoke, the way he stood, that made Dave feel a little uneasy. The black man's confidence seemed out of place in the courthouse. People who came here were usually dressed in formal business suits or lawyer's attire, not the kind of clothes the man was wearing. It wasn't the suit itself, it was how he wore it. There was a certain casualness, almost like he wasn't taking the whole situation seriously. Dave had a job to do, and he was going to do it, no matter what. He had worked here long enough to know that there could be anyone trying to sneak into the courthouse, maybe for a protest or something else. He wasn't about to let someone in without checking their identity first. That was his responsibility, and he took it seriously. "You don't look like someone who should be here," Dave said, his voice a little sterner now. "I need to see some identification." The man's face didn't show much emotion, but inside, he was growing frustrated. He wasn't the type to cause a scene, but this was getting annoying. He didn't want to waste any more time explaining himself, especially not when he had important work to do. Still, he understood that some people had a hard time believing things until they saw them with their own eyes. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small card. It was his official court identification. He held it out to Dave, hoping that would clear up any confusion. "Here," the man said calmly. "This should help." Dave looked down at the card, taking it slowly, like he was unsure if he should accept it. His eyes moved from the card to the man's face, back to the card, and then back to the man. He was trying to process what he was seeing, but something still didn't add up. The card looked official enough, but something about the man just didn't fit the usual picture of who Dave thought belonged in the courthouse. "I'm going to have to call someone," Dave said, finally breaking the silence. "Just to confirm." The man nodded without protest. He wasn't in a rush, but the delay was starting to get frustrating. He had hoped to get inside the courthouse without any trouble, but it seemed like Dave wasn't going to let him pass so easily. As Dave turned away to make the call, the black man stood patiently, trying his best not to show his irritation. People continued walking past him, completely unaware of the situation unfolding at the entrance. Some glanced at the man, then at Dave, but most were too busy with their own thoughts to pay much attention. Inside, Dave dialed the courthouse supervisor, explaining the situation. The black man waited silently, knowing that the truth was just a phone call away. It wasn't the first time people had misjudged him, but today was different. Today, his true identity was about to be revealed in a way that would change everything. What Dave didn't know was that the man standing in front of him wasn't just anyone. He wasn't a random visitor to the courthouse. In fact, he was someone who had been chosen for a much bigger role than Dave could ever imagine. And soon, the security guard would find out exactly who this man was. The minutes seemed to drag on as the black man stood quietly, waiting for the security guard to make his call. His calm expression didn't change, but inside, he was feeling a little more frustrated with each passing second. He had expected some form of respect when he arrived at the courthouse. After all, he was here for a very important reason, and he wasn't about to let this small misunderstanding slow him down. However, he had learned over the years that responding with anger or frustration rarely helped in situations like this. As he stood there, a few more people walked by. They glanced at him, noticing the brief tension between him and the security guard, but most didn't seem to care. A few people gave him sympathetic looks, probably wondering why he was being questioned. But no one dared to speak up. The black man had grown used to being treated this way, especially in places where people didn't know who he was or what he had accomplished. While waiting, the black man's thoughts drifted for a moment. He had worked hard to get to this point in his life. He had faced many challenges, but he had overcome them, one by one. This moment at the courthouse wasn't just another challenge. It was a test of patience. He knew that in time, everything would make sense. The situation would eventually resolve, but until then, he needed to remain composed. Meanwhile, the security guard was still on the phone, explaining the situation to his supervisor. Dave was frustrated too, but for a different reason. He didn't like being questioned, especially by someone who seemed so out of place. He had worked at the courthouse for years, and had never seen anyone like the man standing in front of him. Sure, people came and went every day, but they usually looked like they belonged. This man, with his calm but slightly defiant attitude, didn't fit the usual mold of courthouse visitors. Dave's supervisor, on the other end of the line, could hear the doubt in his voice. "Are you sure about this?" she asked. "You're saying this man is just here for a meeting?" "Yes, that's what he says," Dave replied. "But something feels off. He doesn't seem like he's part of the usual crowd." The supervisor sighed, already tired of Dave's suspicion. "Listen, Dave, I need you to stop. You're dealing with someone important, whether you realize it or not. I'm sending someone to handle this." Dave's stomach dropped. "Someone important? Who is he?" "You'll find out soon enough. I suggest you stay there and don't do anything else until I get there," the supervisor said, her voice firm. Dave stood frozen for a moment. The weight of her words hit him. He was dealing with someone important, someone beyond the usual courthouse visitor. But who could it be? Who was this man who had caught his attention so unexpectedly? The security guard hung up the phone and turned back toward the black man. The man, still standing calmly in front of him, hadn't moved an inch. His posture was relaxed, but there was an air of quiet authority around him that made Dave feel uneasy. He didn't know who this person was, but he was about to find out, in a way he would never forget. Just then, the supervisor arrived at the entrance, her face a mix of curiosity and urgency. Without a word, she walked up to the man, holding out her hand. "I'm so sorry for the confusion," she said, "but I think we need to clear this up." The black man nodded, still composed, as he reached into his pocket to pull out something, a small, official-looking card. His identity was about to be revealed, and the security guard was about to learn exactly who he had just kicked out of the courthouse. The supervisor took the card from the man's hand with a careful glance, though her expression quickly changed from confusion to understanding. She looked down at it, and her eyes widened in surprise. It was clear that whatever the card contained was more than enough to confirm the man's identity. She glanced up at the security guard, her face now serious. "This," she said, her voice calm but firm, "is the new Supreme Judge of the court." Dave's jaw dropped. He had to swallow before he could say anything. The words seemed to echo in his mind, but they didn't quite make sense at first. The new Supreme Judge. That couldn't be right. The man in front of him, the one he had just tried to kick out, was the highest-ranking official in the courthouse. It didn't make sense. The security guard had seen judges and lawyers come through here every day, but none of them had ever looked like this man. The black man, still standing there with a quiet composure, didn't seem surprised by the revelation. In fact, he looked calm and collected, as if he was used to this kind of situation, though it had been clear from the start that he wasn't here to draw attention to himself. Dave tried to speak, but the words seemed stuck in his throat. He felt his face flush with embarrassment. He had no idea who this man was, but now he realized he had made a huge mistake. The fact that he had questioned, stopped, and even suggested the man leave the courthouse felt like an unforgivable act. His mind raced, trying to come up with a way to fix this, but there was nothing he could do to undo what had already happened. The supervisor, seeing his discomfort, sighed and stepped closer to Dave. "This is why we have protocols, Dave. You can't make assumptions based on what someone looks like or how they dress. This man, the new Supreme Judge, is someone you should show respect to, not treat like an outsider." The security guard nodded slowly, his face a mix of guilt and disbelief. He had failed to follow his own training and had let his judgment cloud his actions. He had thought that the man didn't belong, but now he realized that his appearance had nothing to do with his status or importance. His position had already been confirmed. The man in front of him wasn't just any visitor. He was the one who held the power to make decisions that would affect the future of the court and of the entire legal system. I'm so sorry," Dave finally stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't know. I never meant to offend you." The new Supreme Judge simply smiled, his expression warm but firm. "I understand," he said, his voice carrying a calm authority that made it clear he wasn't angry. "But it's important to remember that respect isn't just given to those in powerful positions. It should be shown to everyone, regardless of how they appear." The supervisor gave Dave a stern look, then turned her attention back to the black man. "We'll take it from here, Your Honor," she said, her tone respectful. "Thank you for your patience." The Supreme Judge nodded, turning to head into the courthouse. Dave, still standing in shock, watched as the man walked away, his footsteps confident and purposeful. It was only when the man disappeared through the doors that Dave fully understood the gravity of the situation. He had just made a mistake that would follow him for the rest of his career. As the doors closed behind the new Supreme Judge, Dave took a deep breath and reflected on the lesson he had just learned. First impressions were often wrong, and it was important to treat everyone with respect, no matter who they were or what they looked like. Dave stood there, frozen for a moment. His mind was racing as the realization sank in. He had just questioned, humiliated, and almost kicked out the new Supreme Judge of the court. The man he had treated like any other visitor, assuming he didn't belong, had been someone with immense power and responsibility. Dave couldn't believe it. He had thought the man was just another person walking in with no purpose. But now, everything had changed. His stomach churned with regret. He had been so quick to judge the man based on his appearance and mannerisms, without even thinking twice. He had made an assumption and acted on it, all without knowing the truth. And now, the truth was staring him in the face. The words of the supervisor echoed in his mind. "You can't make assumptions based on what someone looks like or how they dress." Dave felt like a fool. He had always prided himself on being vigilant, always following the rules and doing his job properly. But in this case, he had let his biases get the best of him. He had acted hastily and made a mistake that could cost him dearly. He glanced at the supervisor, who was standing nearby, watching him with a look of disappointment on her face. She wasn't angry, but it was clear she expected better from him. Dave had been one of the more experienced security guards at the courthouse, and this was the kind of mistake that could tarnish his reputation. He had just embarrassed himself in front of the entire courthouse staff, and worst of all, in front of someone who held a position of authority. The supervisor sighed, but she didn't say anything more. She didn't need to. Dave already knew what he had done wrong. He had failed to see the man for who he truly was, and instead, he had judged him based on his appearance, something that went against everything he had been trained to do. He had failed to treat this man with the respect he deserved, and now there was no going back. Dave watched as the Supreme Judge walked further into the courthouse. He couldn't help but wonder what the man thought of him. He had been kind, calm, and composed throughout the entire exchange, never raising his voice or reacting with anger. It was clear that the new Supreme Judge was a person who had learned to deal with situations like this before. He had probably encountered his fair share of people who didn't take him seriously. But it didn't make it any less painful for Dave to realize that he was one of those people. As Dave stood there, he couldn't help but replay the moment over and over in his head. He could see the man's calm expression, his steady voice, and the look in his eyes when he revealed his identity. It was a reminder that appearances could be deceiving, and that everyone deserved respect, regardless of how they looked or who they seemed to be. The supervisor finally broke the silence. "You need to learn from this, Dave," she said, her voice firm but not unkind. "This is a reminder that we can't judge anyone based on their appearance. And next time, you need to be more careful. You never know who you're dealing with." Dave nodded silently. He didn't need any more reminders. He had learned his lesson the hard way, and it was one he wouldn't forget anytime soon. From now on, he would treat everyone with the respect they deserved, no matter who they were or how they looked, and he would never make the same mistake again. As the new Supreme Judge walked deeper into the courthouse, he didn't look back at Dave or the supervisor. His footsteps were measured and confident, but there was no sign of anger or frustration on his face. The situation at the door had been awkward, and it was clear to everyone that Dave had made a huge mistake. Yet the man didn't seem rattled. He walked with the same calmness that had been present since the moment Dave first stopped him. Inside the courthouse, the black man was met with nods of respect from other courthouse staff members. It wasn't that they had recognized him immediately. Many hadn't known exactly when the new Supreme Judge had arrived. But there was a quiet understanding among the staff that this was a man who held great responsibility, someone who was now in charge of the entire judicial system for the region. And he was already earning the respect of everyone around him, whether they knew it or not. As the Supreme Judge made his way to his office, the supervisor returned to Dave, who was still standing by the entrance, deep in thought. He had replayed the moment in his mind over and over, trying to understand how he could have missed something so important. He wasn't sure what hurt more, the fact that he had made the mistake, or the realization that he had disrespected someone who was now in such a powerful position. The supervisor didn't scold Dave further. Instead, she placed a hand on his shoulder, offering a small bit of comfort. "You've learned a hard lesson today, but this doesn't define you, Dave. It's what you do next that matters." Her voice was steady, giving him a chance to reflect. Dave nodded, but he felt hollow inside. He didn't want to be the kind of person who made quick judgments about others, especially when those judgments were wrong. He had always tried to approach people fairly, without bias, but today he had failed. He knew this was a mistake that would stick with him, and it would take time to rebuild the trust he had lost. Meanwhile, in his office, the Supreme Judge was already settling in. He was used to the idea that people might not always take him seriously at first. He had lived through moments when others underestimated him, thinking he was just another face in the crowd. But he had learned not to let that bother him. After all, he had worked tirelessly to get to where he was, and no one could take that away from him. Despite the awkwardness of the encounter earlier, the Supreme Judge didn't hold any grudges. He understood why Dave had acted the way he did. The security guard had no reason to know who he was. People often assumed things based on appearances, especially when they didn't know the full story. What mattered to him now was doing his job, ensuring justice was served, and moving forward with the responsibilities placed in his hands. In the days that followed, the courthouse staff heard whispers about the incident, but it was soon forgotten as the work of the court continued. For Dave, however, the memory lingered. He couldn't help but feel humbled by the experience, and over time, he made an effort to treat everyone with the respect they deserved, no matter who they were or what they looked like. The Supreme Judge's calmness had set an example that would stay with Dave. His grace under pressure, his ability to remain composed in the face of an awkward and frustrating situation, was something Dave would never forget. And in time, it would influence how he treated everyone who walked through the courthouse doors, no longer making assumptions, but offering respect and understanding to all. The days following the incident at the courthouse were strangely quiet for Dave. The routine of checking visitors and managing security was back in full swing, but it didn't feel the same. Every time he looked at the door, he was reminded of the mistake he had made. The black man, now known as the Supreme Judge, had come and gone, but his presence lingered in Dave's mind. The truth was, Dave hadn't been able to stop thinking about the incident. It kept replaying in his head. The way he had assumed the man didn't belong. The way he had treated him with suspicion instead of respect. And how, in the end, he had been proven completely wrong. It wasn't just the mistake that bothered him, but the realization that his actions had been based on nothing more than assumptions and biases. Despite his discomfort, Dave kept his focus on his work. He had to. There was no way to undo what had happened. The only thing he could do now was learn from it. But it wasn't easy. He had always considered himself fair, but this situation had forced him to confront the fact that even he had his prejudices, ones he didn't even know he was carrying. The courthouse staff had quietly moved on from the incident. The Supreme Judge was now a familiar face, someone everyone respected. The staff had started to get used to his calm demeanor and professional approach. They saw how he handled the day-to-day responsibilities with grace, always focused on the job, and never letting anything distract him. He had earned his place, not just because of his title, but because of how he carried himself. People respected him because he respected them first. As for Dave, he had made an effort to keep his head down and focus on his work. He didn't want to make any more mistakes. He was determined to change, to become the kind of person who treated everyone equally, no matter their appearance or background. But it wasn't something that happened overnight. One afternoon, a few weeks after the incident, Dave was stationed at the front entrance again. This time, when he saw a visitor approaching, he didn't feel the usual urge to judge them based on their looks. The person, a young woman in a simple dress, smiled at him as she approached. She seemed polite, but Dave didn't know her. For a brief moment, he wondered about her identity. Was she someone important? Was she here for a big case? Instead of jumping to conclusions, Dave simply greeted her with a smile. "Good afternoon. How can I help you today?" he asked. The woman looked surprised for a moment, but then returned the smile. "I'm just here to see my lawyer. I have an appointment," she explained. Dave nodded, not feeling the need to question her any further. He allowed her to proceed into the building without hesitation. It was a small step, but to him, it felt significant. He had learned something important about himself. He didn't need to make assumptions about people. All he needed to do was offer respect and let them explain themselves. A few minutes later, he saw a familiar face approach. It was the Supreme Judge, walking toward him with his usual calm confidence. Dave stood up straighter, ready to greet him. The judge gave him a small, acknowledging nod, but didn't say anything. Dave, however, felt a sense of pride in himself. He had learned from his mistake, and it was clear that the Supreme Judge wasn't holding any grudges. Over time, Dave became more mindful of his actions and decisions. He made it a point to treat everyone he encountered with the respect they deserved. And although the mistake he made that day would never be completely forgotten, he knew that it had changed him for the better. The Supreme Judge's quiet lesson had stuck with him, a reminder that respect wasn't something to be earned based on appearances. It was something that should be given freely to everyone. Weeks turned into months, and life at the courthouse carried on. For the Supreme Judge, the work was demanding, but he remained calm and collected. His role as the highest authority in the courthouse required quick decisions, a steady hand, and an unwavering commitment to justice. But despite the pressures, he never let it change who he was. He was a man of principle, and he had learned early on that respect was key to earning the trust of those around him. His ability to remain composed in all situations, even when faced with challenges or unexpected events, had earned him admiration from both his colleagues and those who came before him in court. As for Dave, things had started to feel different. He had never imagined how much one mistake could change the way he saw the world. The encounter with the Supreme Judge had shifted his perspective on respect, and it had made him reflect on how he treated others. He had always been someone who tried to do his job well, but now he was more focused on the bigger picture. The people behind the uniforms, the suits, and the titles. He had learned that it wasn't enough to just follow the rules. It was about treating everyone with dignity, no matter where they came from or what they looked like. A few months after the incident, Dave found himself in the courthouse's break room during lunch. He had been talking to a few of the other security staff members when one of them brought up the new Supreme Judge. "Have you noticed how he's been handling things around here?" one of the guards asked. Dave nodded, thinking back to how calm the judge always seemed, no matter what was going on. "Yeah, he's something else. Never loses his cool, no matter what happens." Another guard chimed in. "It's not just about staying calm. He knows how to make everyone feel valued. It doesn't matter if you're a lawyer or someone working in the back. He treats everyone the same." Dave's eyes widened slightly. It was true. He had seen how the Supreme Judge interacted with people. It wasn't just about authority or power. It was about making others feel heard, respected, and important. That was why he had earned the trust of everyone. from the lowliest clerk to the highest-ranking lawyer. The judge didn't rule with an iron fist. He ruled with fairness and understanding. Later that afternoon, Dave had the chance to observe the Supreme Judge in action. A group of attorneys had gathered in the main hall, waiting for their case to be called. The judge walked in, and immediately the room grew silent. Everyone stood up as a sign of respect. He made his way to the front, but instead of sitting right away, he looked around the room, acknowledging the presence of everyone. "Good afternoon," he said in his calm, measured voice. "I hope everything is going well for all of you today." The room responded with polite nods and murmurs. There was no formality in the judge's tone. It was more like he was greeting his colleagues than ordering them around. He seemed to connect with everyone as if they were equals, regardless of their rank. After the case was heard and a decision was made, the Supreme Judge stood up again. He addressed the attorneys with a few kind words of encouragement, reminding them to always keep the best interests of justice at heart. As he left the courtroom, the attorneys remained silent for a moment, reflecting on his words. They were used to seeing judges who gave orders from a distance, but this was different. The Supreme Judge wasn't just someone who made decisions. He was someone who cared about the process and the people involved. For Dave, watching all of this unfold was a revelation. The Supreme Judge had earned his respect not through power or intimidation, but by demonstrating a quiet strength that resonated with everyone he encountered. It made Dave realize that leadership wasn't just about commanding authority. It was about being fair, understanding, and compassionate. As the days passed, Dave worked harder to embody the qualities he had seen in the Supreme Judge. He continued to treat everyone with the respect they deserved, no matter their background. He knew that the lesson he had learned in the past months would stay with him forever, and that it was never too late to change and grow. The Supreme Judge's legacy had already begun to take shape within the courthouse, not through his rulings, but through his example. And for Dave, it was a lesson that he would carry with him throughout his life. Months had passed since the awkward encounter at the courthouse entrance, but its lessons still lingered in Dave's mind. He had grown accustomed to the idea of treating everyone with fairness and respect. But the most powerful lessons had come from watching the new Supreme Judge at work. The judge wasn't just about making decisions from behind a desk. He was about engaging with the people he interacted with, showing them that their voices mattered. Dave had witnessed it firsthand, how the judge never allowed anyone to feel small or unheard. Whether it was a janitor sweeping the halls or a high-profile attorney presenting a case, the Supreme Judge treated them all with the same level of respect. There was no difference in how he spoke to people, no sense of superiority in his tone. The humility and grace he showed had a profound impact on everyone around him, and it was a quality that Dave admired more and more. Over time, Dave noticed that the courthouse staff had started to shift in subtle ways. People were more willing to speak up in meetings, more comfortable voicing their concerns, and more committed to doing their jobs well. They had begun to take on the same values that the Supreme Judge demonstrated: fairness, understanding, and a deep commitment to justice. The change wasn't instant, but it was clear that the judge's influence had spread through the building. One day, during a break, Dave was chatting with one of the courthouse clerks, a young woman who had been working there for a few months. She mentioned how different the atmosphere felt since the judge's arrival. "It's like he's brought something new to this place," she said, taking a sip of her coffee. "Everyone is more focused, more respectful, even during stressful cases. It's like he cares about each one of us, not just the big decisions. You know." Dave nodded, feeling the sense of pride swell inside him. He had seen it too. That quiet shift, that transformation in the way people interacted with one another. It wasn't just because of the judge's power. It was because of the way he made people feel. He didn't demand respect. He earned it with every action, every word. That afternoon, Dave had a chance to observe the Supreme Judge once again. The courtroom was full, the tension thick as the next case was about to begin. As the judge entered, everyone rose in respect, but this time, There was a sense of warmth in the room that hadn't been there before. The judge acknowledged the room with a nod and a simple greeting. "Good afternoon, everyone. I hope we can work together to reach the best conclusion today," he said with a calm smile, his voice carrying just enough authority without being overbearing. Dave noticed how the people in the courtroom responded. They were more engaged, more cooperative, and somehow more motivated to do their best. It wasn't the judge's title or position that made the difference. It was his genuine approach to people. He wasn't there to intimidate or belittle. He was there to guide, to listen, and to work with them. By now, Dave had come to understand that the Supreme Judge was more than just the person who made rulings. He was a leader, a role model, and a reminder of the importance of treating everyone with dignity. The impact of that encounter, the one that had once been a source of embarrassment, had changed not just Dave's actions, but the entire atmosphere of the courthouse. And now, Dave saw it every day. The respect that the Supreme Judge had shown him, even after the awkward incident, had taught him a powerful lesson. It wasn't enough to just follow the rules. True leadership came from the way you treated others, from how you made them feel valued and heard. It was about showing kindness, even when mistakes were made, and encouraging others to do the same. As the judge wrapped up another case that afternoon, Dave stood silently by the door, watching the scene unfold before him. It was clear to him now that respect, fairness, and compassion were the foundations of justice, the values that guided not just the Supreme Judge, but everyone who worked alongside him. And in that moment, Dave knew that he would carry these lessons with him, not just at the courthouse, but in every part of his life.